Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, we are in the middle of budget battles. The top story on Cal Matters this morning was the article that reminded me that the state budget had gone from a surplus of $100 billion this time last year, and now we are at $32 billion deficit, which is now sending lawmakers scrambling. The law says that we have to pass a budget by June 15th, and that's Thursday, or they don't get paid. So by the time some of you listeners listen to this podcast, a bill might have been passed. But Tim, what are some of the big differences between the governor's budget and the legislature?
Yes, they will pass a budget by Thursday at midnight. They will tick the box. We've passed a budget. But that does not mean it's the final budget because obviously they do not have an agreement with the governor. The governor has until June 30th to sign or veto the budget. There really are three big areas of disagreement between the governor and the legislative leaders. So the first is transportation funding, and really it's transit funding. You know, next week, I'm going to give our listeners a preview of coming attractions. We have a great interview with Steve Greenhut and Mark Jaffe, who's one of the state's top transportation experts. And they talk about all things related to transportation. As an aside, transportation agencies have a huge budget deficit this year because we've had a huge drop in ridership. And as Mark Jaffe notes, this was happening in the years before the pandemic. He said right now, ridership has gone to about 40% of 2019 levels. And he argues that it's due to kind of the issues we would expect, right? They're not clean, they're not safe. The point really is, okay, yes, our transit agencies are having a huge funding deficit because there aren't the riders to pay the fares to keep the system going. But the argument being, should we really bail out these agencies without asking for fundamental reforms? You know, look at union contracts, look at levels of service, you know, to provide the service that people expect and would want to take. And so Democrats in the legislature want to have a $2.2 billion in funding for these agencies to kind of bail out, you know, the transit agencies like BART across the state that are suffering huge issues. But got to tell you, you know, I've been reading about what the BART board has been considering. They won't even consider an appropriate level of cuts, you know, commensurate with the budget deficit that they found themselves in. And they won't even, one BART board member asked the staff to just look into what are our options for cuts if we wanted to do it. They voted down even having their staff look into the matter. You know, I think it's just, once again, kind of legislative Dems looking out for their kind of constituencies and their, you know, the transit workers unions and such who are really the beneficiary of these funds and environmentalists who push these dollars. But Newsom is saying, hey, in any tough budget year, you know, we're going to have some cuts, and that's one thing that's going to be on the table.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see who wins that battle, because we know how tied the unions are to the lawmakers in the state. And I don't know, where do you think this is going to go? I think it's going to go with the lawmakers. What do you think?
Well, historically, when we've had kind of these annual, and really lately it's more kind of minor skirmishes between governors and the legislative leadership, the governor typically dominates the legislature on these issues because at the end of the day, the governor has the power of the line item veto. So my prediction would be there'll be some pot of money for transit, but not $2.2 billion.
That's good news, because, Tim, I think I'm the only person I know who doesn't have a car. And while I take Uber, I still often take public transportation. I have my whole life, my whole career. I've ridden on BART and Metro and so forth. And it wasn't great before, but now it's deteriorated so much that I think people are willing to scrimp on other things and take private or Uber transportation instead of public transportation, which is too bad, because I would be one person who would be willing to do it. Another bone of contention are these climate change spending. So looks like the legislature doesn't want to cut back on the parks and the water recycling and so on. And Newsom would like to do some trimming there.
Yeah, he basically has said that if the revenue doesn't come in, then this about about a little over $1 billion in funding for these programs will go away because we don't have the revenue to fund them. Newsom rightly makes the point. We spent a lot of money on climate change and on green initiatives. And, we just don't have the luxury of having the money to spend on everything this year.
What I found fascinating was that to pay for these parks and recycling and so on, the legislature wants to raid our little strategic energy reserves that we had put together last year. And I could imagine that the last thing Newsom wants is California to have brownouts all over the state. And we know what that's like for governor's political ambitions.
That's right. We have had power grid issues the last 2 summers. We don't know. It's been a mild summer. Actually, it's been a downright chilly summer season thus far. You need the money and flexibility to keep the lights on. And the governor also understands governors get blamed when the lights go out. The legislature doesn't. Well, here you're going to have really kind of a dumb political move. Now, legislators who back this plan would have that guilt on their hands because they would have cut the funding that we need to have that flexibility to keep the grid afloat. It really makes no sense that you would pull that money. And it shows that legislators really care more about funding the proposals that would benefit their cronies rather than really prioritizing where we should be when spending on the environment and climate.
I think one thing that listeners might be wondering about is how we could go from $100 billion surplus to a $30 billion deficit in just over a year. And it seems counterintuitive that we could, have this $130-something billion switch. How does that happen? We've written about this at PRI time and again, but I think it's worth refreshing listeners on how this happens.
Sure. Well, some of it is California has a very volatile tax system that's heavily reliant on capital gains taxes. When the economy has a little sneeze, that really can have a significant effect on tax revenue overnight. So we've had some downtimes for the stock market. Things are doing a little bit better as of late, but we've had some downtime on the stock market over the past 6 to 8 months, and that directly affects revenue to California. So you can go overnight from a $20 billion surplus to a $20 billion deficit just on that alone. The other thing is we got a lot of money from Washington during COVID-19 and during the first 2 years of the Biden administration, when you had a more favorable combination of a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, and Speaker Pelosi was still in. So, the cash flow was turned on to California. Well, now with divided government, that cash flow is turned off. So we can't expect that we're going to get any of that money. And remember, as part of the deal just enacted in Congress to avert the debt ceiling, Congress is going to claw back unspent COVID-19 funds. So not only are we not going to get new money, well, we might be losing some money that we expected to have to spend. So just those 2 things alone can really turn a great budget year into a bad one almost overnight.
And I would add to that, there's some long-term issues that we have here in California. One is that the wealthy are leaving the state. The top 1% of Californians, in terms of personal income, pay 50% of personal income taxes in the state. So if you have people leaving the state, especially at that highest tax bracket, and we tax them a lot, then that's going to also diminish our receipts. Also, keep in mind, a lot of corporations have been leaving the state because we have a tough business climate here. So that's got to be diminishing tax receipts. So we've got a lot of long-term issues on top of these short-term issues in terms of California receipts. The prospects don't look good for the state.
And people don't appreciate how important it is to have corporate headquarters located in California for tax revenue purposes. And we are really bleeding corporate headquarters, moving right and left to Texas and Florida and Nashville and, other lower tax states. And, that's a real punch in the gut as far as state tax revenue that we rely on to fund all these programs.
And Tim, you've been in Sacramento forever. Just to let our listeners know, June 15th, Thursday, is not exactly the deadline, even though, on paper and by law it is. These negotiations can go on for a long time. Explain how that works.
Yeah, so they will pass a budget by June 15th, but it doesn't mean it's a budget that the governor agrees on. They have, quote, passed the budget. They passed a budget bill. The governor and legislators will continue to negotiate. I would be very surprised if the governor doesn't sign a budget by June 30th. Whatever changes they agree upon to strike a budget deal, they'll put it in a separate bill. And then there are a whole bunch of other issues that we're still debating, such as, the governor has his proposals for secret reform related to green and infrastructure projects that he wants considered as part of the budget process. And the Democrats have really given cold shoulder to that. But just because we passed July 1st and the beginning of the new fiscal year doesn't mean that work on all these other related budget issues ends. And so we can be passing what they call budget trailer bills, or those are the policy bills that implement policy changes related to the budget deal. They'll be negotiating and passing those in July, in August. They could even be passing them in January or February. There's few restrictions on what you can call a budget trailer bill and take advantage of that. There's some advantages as far as, you just need a majority vote and the bills take effect immediately. So the kind of outstanding policy issues related to the budget, they'll be debating those for months to come, I think.
We'll continue to follow these budget battles. Meantime, we'll move on to our next guest. Tim, you want to introduce the topic of our podcast this week?
Yes. So last week, PRI released a terrific study by our Winegarden and Kerry Jackson, Sapping California's Energy Future, on the issue of electric cars and our green energy mandates. And for everyone who's been wondering, hey, we're going to have 100% electric car sales requirement by 2035, and we have all these renewable energy mandates by 2045. Are we going to be able to have enough power generated to meet all of these mandates? And so our Wayne and our Kerry took about crunching the numbers to see, what will happen. And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. We're not going to be able to meet the demand. And Wayne goes through all of his research in the study and some of the other issues, the challenges related to having an all-electric vehicle future, and then talks about, well, what should we do instead if we want to, continue down the path of, meeting the spirit of our climate change goals, but in a way that is more doable and realistic and doesn't impose huge costs and huge burdens on Californians. And, oh, by the way, doesn't lead to having blackouts every day. So if you're interested in these sorts of issues and our green future, I think you'll find our discussion with Wayne a very interesting and timely one, as these issues are all being debated during the budget.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. And here's Wayne Winegarden. So we're so happy to have you back on the podcast to talk about your new study, Sapping California's Energy Future, which our listeners can download a copy at pacificresearch.org. So before we dive into the findings of your study, perhaps you could set the stage for us. You write a lot about California's government-mandated green mandates. What exactly are these mandates that Californians will have to comply with in the coming years?
There are so many mandates. It's almost getting to the point where it's getting difficult to keep track of them. So we have mandates on how we can use electricity and how we can generate electricity, if we're going to take those two big buckets. So we're going to mandate that we're not going to use natural gas to generate electricity anymore. Now we have to go all to what they call renewable sources. So that boils down to wind and solar. We're going to mandate that. Then we're going to mandate how you can consume it. So instead of using a typical internal combustion engine car, you have to buy an electric vehicle. Not that you can, if you want to, you have to. And it's moving on from there. Your stove in places, and there's a growing movement to ban natural gas in new stoves, in ovens, in water heaters. So you can't use a natural gas water heater. It's going to have to be all electricity. So it's a comprehensive top-down dictation about how you can consume and produce energy.
So following up on that discussion of renewable energy, can you give us a snapshot of what makes up our energy power mix in California today? You have what I found to be a very startling figure in your study about how much power we produce today that actually comes from sources that will be disfavored in the future. And how do state officials propose to make up for this lost power?
Well, I think the first thing you have to recognize when we're talking about our current electricity and where it comes from is that 30% about it varies from year to year, but about 30% comes from other states, or what they call imports. So we can only internally generate 70% of our own electricity. So that's the first thing to recognize, that we're already seeing the problems with our current grid because we can't generate enough electricity for Californians. Now, of that 70% that we do produce, about half of that is going to come from natural gas, which of course we're going to be phasing out, but half comes from natural gas. When you include nuclear, the small bit of coal, as well as a large hydro, which, while is renewable, it's disfavored. You're talking about close to 2/3 of our electricity comes from sources that environmentalists disfavor. What they propose to do is they're going to shut down, mandated, they're going to shut down natural gas. They're going to shut down coal. We're already shutting down our nuclear. We only have one nuclear power plant left. We've extended its life. And we extended its life because, for all practical reasons, we had to. If we would have shut that down, we'd have electricity shortages in the here and now. But we're going to shut down all of these sources and replace them with what's called zero-emission or low-emission sources. And the reason why I emphasize that is you have to remember those sources are basically, when you talk about what's possible, is wind and solar. And you have to remember that wind and solar runs on minerals that have to be dug up from the earth. So just like natural gas, you have to dig it up out of the earth. Well, solar and wind, you have to dig that up out of the earth. You process it, you use it for a while, and then you dispose of it. So in many ways, it's no different than the current sources that we rely on. Nevertheless, those are the favored sources, and we're going to replace our natural gas and our nuclear with solar and wind. That's the game. That's the whole idea.
So as you just noted, perhaps the biggest green mandate coming down the pipeline is the 100% electric vehicle mandate, which is the focus of the study. So Wayne, give us the bad news from your research. What did you find about the impact of this particular mandate will be on California's power grid in both the short and long term?
The impact is going to be troubling. So what the impact is going to do is it's going to raise our costs. It's going to worsen the problem of energy poverty. It's going to lead to shortages. So we're going to need to have brownouts and blackouts. So if we continue down this path, we're not going to be able to have a stable grid, a reliable grid, or a grid that can generate the electricity that we need. And that's going to actually start to impact us relatively soon. So as I was just saying, according to the mandates, we're going to be shutting down the disfavored sources, the natural gas and the nuclear, and we're going to replace that with solar and wind. And what we did in the study is we said, okay, if we just looked at that trade-off, so we're going to take away all of our fossil fuel-based electricity and our nuclear-based electricity and replace it with solar and wind. And we said, okay, let's look at how we've been consuming electricity over time, both businesses and families, and kind of project that out over the time horizon that we're going to be phasing out all of the different sources and bringing in the solar and wind. So we have a sense of how much we're going to consume. And then we say, okay, well, how much have we been building solar and wind in the past? The idea being, of course, we've been emphasizing this for many years. So the past is somewhat prologue in terms of what we can achieve, not what politicians say, want to achieve or say what we can achieve, but in practice, what have we achieved? And when you do that, you actually see that, well, we're not going to generate enough electricity, just not even worrying about balancing the grid, just in terms of how much we're going to consume when you take all of the vehicles we have now and turn them from fossil fuel-based cars, right, or typical gas-powered cars, and we turn them into electric vehicles, we are just not going to be able to generate enough electricity in aggregate. And in fact, what we found is that you're going to see a 21% gap between the amount of electricity the grid can generate compared to how much electricity we need. And again, that's not even worrying about if we can balance the grid, if we can make sure that when I turn my lights on, I flip the switch, my lights come on. What we haven't even taken into account that core fundamental kind of delivery that the grid has to do, which is provide electricity on demand. We didn't even worry about that question. We just can't even generate enough electricity when you balance out those mandates for how we're going to generate and just the amount of electricity you need to charge up all of those electric vehicles.
So, Wayne, you also argue that the power generation deficit that you just mentioned is actually a very conservative number, as you really just focused on the electric car issues. So in your view, why will our power deficit be much higher than even your calculations say it will be?
Well, the first thing is what I just talked about. You put into air quotes the balancing the grid on a second by second basis, and that's the air quotes. I'm sorry. There's small problem small problem of balancing the grid. That is everything. And so what happens is at nighttime when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing very much. Well, that's when everyone's plugging in their electric vehicles, assuming we all get our charging stations up and running. Well, that there's going to be a tremendous shortage at those moments, and so all of a sudden, the ability to have that reliable electricity at night is going to be compromised. But on top of that, we also didn't take into account the intermittency of solar and wind, so that the ability to balance the grid with an intermittent source is much more difficult. And that's going to actually lead to, in some years, significantly less power, perhaps in other years, more power, but perhaps not when we need it. But that whole intermittency of the solar and wind source, we didn't take that into account. We didn't take into account all the other bands that we talked about earlier, the gas water heater, gas ovens, gas stoves, all of these appliances that we're going to try to force onto the grid. We didn't take a look into any of those factors. And we also assumed a good amount of conservation on the part of families. Because if you look over the last several years, the residential use of electricity has been relatively flat, and we just assumed that was going to maintain itself. But there's many reasons to believe, and especially if we could get a growing economy or reverse the migration out of California, that you would actually have an increase in that demand. We didn't take into account into that. We assumed that demand would be flat. So we really tried to give the most generous assumptions in terms of the draw on the electricity grid, and yet we still found that 21% generation gap.
Wayne, instead of natural gas and nuclear, Sacramento progressives are promoting wind power, particularly offshore wind power. But there are a lot of issues. You would think that California would be a prime spot for wind power, but your study highlights several challenges with wind power as an alternative energy source. What has your research found about the limitation of wind power?
With respect to wind, there's a couple of issues which really makes it unlikely that it can serve that fundamental generation source that progressives hope when they're designing this new kind of electricity generation system. The first problem is that they're going to rely mostly on offshore wind. And offshore wind is not ready for prime time. And there's some unique features in California that make it even less likely for it to be a reliable source. Now, onshore wind has its own problems. There's possible health impacts. There's certainly the inconvenience of the windmills, and certainly the disposal of the wind mill itself after it's had its life has run its course. There are certainly issues with that. But offshore has even more difficulties. And the problem is that we're really relying on that offshore wind for its generation. The wind off of California's coast are very strong. And in theory, it could serve as a great source. The problem is that the topography of the ocean, there's a huge drop off very quickly. And that matters because most offshore wind, they are affixed to the bottom of the ocean. And you can't do that with such a deep kind of drop off on the California coast. So then what has to happen is you have to build these floating platforms. Well, the floating platforms are not tested. We really don't have a good sense of how well they can work. They're a lot more expensive to build. So you don't have the reliability. You don't have the expense. You have the expense. And so it just makes the likelihood that we can generate all of this offshore wind, make that a reality on the platform itself, on building the actual wind facility itself, it's very unlikely. Now, if we can somehow overcome that obstacle, we then have the obstacle of, well, how do the transmission lines work? Because you have to lay the transmission lines from those offshore platforms all the way in. So even if you could overcome all of those obstacles, you're talking about relying on what would become the most expensive generation resource. And again, we're doing that, and we actually don't know what the impact is going to be on the environment when these wear out. What are you going to do with the blades? Do these windmills, these giant windmills, these wind farms off the shore, how do they impact marine life? How do they impact whales? So there's a huge environmental impact that these can have as well. And we haven't really studied those at all. So there's a lot of reason to be skeptical of both the environmental impact as well as whether it can be achieved. And if it can be achieved, can it be achieved cost effectively?
So solar power, of course, is touted as one of the main alternative energy sources that Sacramento progressives want to expand to replace a lot of our current power mix. But we know that solar power would require a lot of infrastructure development and a lot of land. But your report also highlights some other limitations with solar. So can you share some of these drawbacks of solar that you found?
Sure. And some of these actually apply to the wind as well. I probably should have mentioned, but just as good to mention with respect to solar. The first is the minerals, right? We talked about the need that alternative energy relies on rare earth elements in order to be able to generate the electricity. Well, those elements, now that everybody wants to use these alternative resources, are in high demand. And there's the mines, which typically are in places that use child labor or slave labor and do all sorts of other environmental damage. So that in and of itself is troubling. But you also then have just this huge demand and limited supply. So they're just getting the materials is going to be a problem. And if you can get the material, it's going to be very costly. So there's that very pragmatic issue that's going to obstruct our ability to generate the amount of solar that we're hoping to generate. But then there's also siting issue. So in order to get the optimal amount of solar energy, you need to put the panels in the right place. Well, that can be environmentally damaging, particularly to desert landscapes where you actually see these resources working the best. Again, what other types of impact are they going to have on wildlife? So there's all sorts of environmental questions that are out there. And then you then have the transmission lines again, so that you need to actually get the solar energy from where it's being generated to where it's needed, which aren't necessarily the same. And so that's problematic. On top of it all, there's a lot of construction. And so the problem of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, that's going to be out there. So that has to be overcome. And then, of course, the disposal. Solar panels have a lot of rare earth elements that can be quite toxic. They wear out. And now we have to dispose of it. And now you have an environmental pollutant that you have to deal with. So there's, in life, Thomas always, what's always said, there's only trade-offs. And that's the idea with alternative energy, that there's trade-offs. And with solar power, I should say, there's a lot of trade-offs and a lot of environmental degradation, a lot of unreliability that are associated with it. And so those problems have to be managed.
So, Wayne, the limitations of battery power are another big challenge with the move to 100% renewable power. Based on your findings, what are some of the current limitations with battery power for electric vehicles, especially related to minerals? And what does the research tell us about whether innovation will be able to overcome these limitations going forward?
Well, when you talk about batteries, we're really talking about two things. If we're talking about with the electric vehicles, when you're talking about, 1,000 pounds or 2,000 pound huge batteries that are required to move the electric vehicle. And so again, the cost of that, the competition for the rare earth elements, those are all factors that are going to make it difficult, for the entire fleet to be turned into electric vehicles. On top of that, batteries create issues when you have battery fires, which seems to be a growing issue. Those are dangerous. Those are difficult to put out. They can create health issues. So there's there's really those concerns with the battery health issues as it relates to that. And you also have an issue in this. I don't know if you've seen more of these flatbed tow trucks out there, but you were seeing more and more of those because electric vehicles can't be towed in a traditional manner. They require that more expensive flatbed towing. So there's all those types of questions. And you have to remember, that's based on the current technology, which can't get you as far as a internal combustion engine can get you in terms of one tank of gas versus one charge of the battery. So you're getting all of this in terms of problems, and the limitation is there. So there's that trade-off that we really have to wonder, is it really worth it at this point? You also have an issue with batteries, and I'll be very quick about this, which you didn't mention but is important. In order for solar and wind to overcome its intermittency issue, you need batteries that don't yet exist and that some people would tell you is physically impossible to create. And yet those are the batteries that we would need in order to make the solar and wind work. So you have those physical limitations of batteries that are out there as well.
So, Wayne, following up on this, you've been writing recently about the Biden administration's push to revive the controversial Clean Power Plan from the Obama era. And as you've documented in your research, the Clean Power Plan, whatever form it takes, would impose huge cost burdens on working Californians. And unfortunately, it's really an example of taking a bad idea from California nationwide. So if the administration succeeds in adopting and implementing the revised Clean Power Plan, how would this complicate the problems about electric cars and renewable energy that you outline in your research?
It's a little bit of been there, done that, right? Directly, the first thing is we import 30% of our electricity from other states. We talked about that earlier. So we can only import that amount of electricity if, of course, if those states are generating excess electricity. But if all of those states are adopting the California approach, then they won't be generating excess electricity. So there's going to be no one to export that power to California. And right off the bat, we're going to face a devastating electricity shortage in the state if the rest of the country adopts that Clean Power Plan approach. But then the problems start to compound from there. Because one, we also import manufactured goods from other states, right? Our cars aren't made generally in California; they're made in Detroit or Tennessee, and so if they're facing higher electricity costs in those states, that means that manufactured goods here are going to be more expensive. So that's going to worsen the affordability problem here in California. And then, of course, if the national economy slows down, then California's economy is going to slow down. So our income growth is going to slow. Our prosperity here is going to worsen. That's going to compound the affordability problems because we are part of the United States. And so what harms the country harms California. So even though they're adapting the standards that we have, there's still some direct and indirect costs that we're going to face that's going to make things worse here in California.
Wayne, one of the less talked about issues is infrastructure, specifically related to having enough charging infrastructure to meet the demand and also the power grid. Got a funny little story for you. Ben Smithick, our colleague who runs development, he owns a Tesla and he was out and about. He raises our funds, so he's out and about driving all the time. And he looked at the app and he saw 3 charging stations where he was. So he drove over there, and 2 of them were broken and 1 was occupied. And so that threw off his day. And you're going to get problems like this all the time. And can you explain these unique and complex challenges and what state officials are planning to overcome?
Yeah, no, that's actually a huge problem. The idea that charging stations aren't maintained well. So there was a study that came out of UC Berkeley, and that estimated only about 73% of the charging stations in San Francisco were working properly. So the maintaining the charging stations, assuming they are built, is in and of itself a huge problem. But then building out that charging infrastructure is a huge endeavor that we haven't even scratched the surface on. So there's just not nearly enough public charging stations to actually make this to reality. And the amount that you would have to build is just astronomical compared to kind of what our ability to do it, certainly within this time frame. We also haven't talked about the difficulty if you live in, let's say, a garden style apartment. How do you get a charging station at home? That becomes a reality. And also that's a huge cost. So now we have a really regressive mandate that's going to just worsen kind of the practical poverty in the country, because the cost of living here is just going to be forced up. So, what we're really doing is we're creating another costly mandate that's going to harm lower income individuals for a system that has not proven itself to be effective. And that is in and of itself very troubling, but it also shows that our electric vehicles are not going to be convenient because it's going to be very difficult to keep them charged. The other thing, which I didn't mention, but I should, is the draw on the grid. When people typically charge their electric vehicles when they get home from work at night. Well, if everybody is drawing on the grid at that moment, we're going to make a huge demand surge at the grid exactly when solar facilities are turning off. And that's going to create a huge reliability issue. So there's all sorts of concerns about our ability to create the kind of the necessary charging infrastructure. And if we can, the cost of that is going to be so difficult that it's really quite problematic.
So we've heard about all the problems with the electric car mandate and the other car mandates. So now it's time for some solutions. So state officials, obviously, we hope, can't be blind to the challenges that you're pointing out, or are they? So how does state government say they're going to overcome these challenges? And do you think it's realistic to do so and still meet the 2045 deadline?
I don't think it's realistic outside of some kind of miracle change in technology, right? And that also, if somehow that miracle comes, that still doesn't make it a good idea to do that now. If you take your rent money and go to Vegas, even if you somehow win, that still wasn't a good idea. The risk was too high, and so that's kind of the situation that we're in right now. And what we really want to do is two things. One, use the technologies, the low emission technologies that are viable today, and that revolves around a lot of nuclear. And there's been some amazing advancements in nuclear power that can help construct these more efficiently. We'll be able to construct them faster and cheaper. And so we need to leverage those resources that are working. And so there's a lot of excitement, and we should really leverage that nuclear technology. The other thing that we need to do is overcome all the obstacles we've been talking about today. And that requires innovation. But innovation doesn't come from Sacramento, and it doesn't come from Washington, D.C. Innovation comes from millions of individuals who are able to experiment or to express their preferences. And that's what the market does. The market is so effective because it empowers millions of people to experiment, to express their preferences. And so what we need is for a market-based approach that encourages innovation to overcome the problems with solar, or to come up with a better alternative than solar. Maybe it's fusion. There's some really interesting improvements in fusion technology that have been in the news, and maybe that's the next solution. But we need to encourage that. One way that California can help accelerate, and where we really should have policymakers spending their time, is, well, how can they encourage that type of private sector innovation? And they can do that by lessening the regulatory burden, maybe allowing CEQA, some sort of CEQA exemption if you're working on an alternative energy process, or certainly a CEQA streamline if you're working on an alternative energy project. Certainly tax abatement, or allowing depreciation, more preferable depreciation. All of those can increase the returns for investing in these alternative technologies, and by increasing that return, incentivizing more investment. And that's a much more practical way, and in the end, much more likely to come up with not just the solution, but the many solutions to address this issue.
So Wayne, as we close, let's talk about another negative impact people will face this summer thanks to California's green mandates: prices at the pump. So based on what you're reading, how much can drivers expect to pay this summer? And how much do green mandates enacted by state government drive up gas prices here in the state?
Well, the green mandates here drive up gas prices, tremendously. We pay $1, $2, sometimes $3 more than other places because of all of our mandates and our taxes. When you look at gas prices and oil prices, they hit historic highs. Our average gas prices, not too long ago, were peaking over $6 a gallon, and now we're back down to $5. Now, $5 historically would be historic highs, except for what we've just been through. But they have come back down. So we're not likely to see a surge back up to $6 unless we were going to see another huge incident, geopolitical, maybe something with Ukraine, the Middle East, something along those lines. But, and that's the good news. The bad news is that oil has been staying around $80 a barrel, which means our prices around $5 a barrel are likely to persist. And, that is unaffordable for many families. So while we're not going to have those crushing issues that we saw earlier this year, it seems very likely that we're going to continue to have elevated gas prices for the summer. And that is certainly going to impact people's ability to go on those family vacations and enjoy their time off. So gas prices in California are exceptionally expensive, and they're exceptionally expensive because we have some of the highest gas taxes in the country. We have mandates and formulation requirements that are much more stringent and much more costly, and there's much fewer refineries that can make our special formulation. So that means that we're subject to much wilder price swings, because when those refineries have issues or they face shortages, that gets amplified in California. And all of these mandates are unique to California, and they make our gas prices significantly more expensive than the rest of the country.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And listeners can check out Wayne's new study, Sapping California's Energy Future, on pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.